This is Comics vs. Show for The Walking Dead, Season 6, Episode 2, 3, and 4. So this is Comics vs. Show for episodes 2, 3, and 4 of Season 6. I was very sick with a cold and then sinus infection, so I never got around to making these videos, which is actually for the good because episode 4 didn't really have a lot to base off of for Comics vs. Show, and I think in the future if there's an episode that so deviates from the comics, we might combine multiple episodes for Comics vs. Show in the future. If you are new to Comics vs. Show, it's just where we take an episode or episodes of The Walking Dead on AMC and compare the similarities and differences to the comics. It is in no way saying which is better. I love the show and I love the comics. It's just a fun analysis of things that I noticed in the show. There are comic spoilers, so if you planned on reading the comics, do not watch this. If there are show spoilers or potential show spoilers, I will always let you know before I say it. We met Denise for the first time in episode 2, and Denise said that she went to med school, she had panic attacks, she wanted to become a surgeon, but when she started having her anxieties, she ended up getting interested in psychology and became a psychiatrist instead. In the comics, Denise seems to be a very confident doctor, unlike her show counterpart, and she actually is a surgeon, not a psychiatrist. So, comics, Denise did not succumb to anxiety and then become interested in psychology instead. As well, she seems to be very confident in herself in treating injuries in the comics. She's also a bit more fit in the comics versus the show. However, besides weight, I think they match in appearance pretty well. However, just like in the show and the comics, the first patient we see Denise work on actually does end up dying. They die a bit differently, it's under different circumstances, but it's a little intriguing to me that the first patient we see both show and comic Denise work on ends up dying. I kind of wondered why they went for the anxious, unsure doctor route for the show, but I'm guessing it's to add a bit more drama of will she, won't she save the patient, and watching her grow as a person and a physician. Jesse, just like in the show, in the comics, Jesse had a really hard time figuring out what to say to Ron about his dad being dead. And Ron, even though comics Ron was a kid and show Ron is a teen, really had a hard time dealing with his dad being gone. In the show, Jesse's a lot stronger than what we saw in the comics. In the comics, Jesse would have never picked up scissors and stabbed a wolf to death like we saw in the show. That was really surprising to me when we saw Jesse just go crazy on the wolf. So, comics Jesse is a lot more dependent on people, a lot more dependent on Rick. She's a little closer to Rick too, but I'm assuming that's going to happen. So it's definitely a bit different in strength level. As well, dealing with the whole Ron-Jesse thing, in the comics Ron and Carl are actually friends and get along really well and hang out. In the show they don't, but I have a feeling that that's because they're teenagers, and obviously a child is going to understand their father being killed by another boy's father a little differently than a teenager is, so that's kind of what I chalk it up to. But in the comics, Ron and Carl had sleepovers and would play with each other, and they were pretty cool with each other. And actually in the comics, when Ron goes up to Carl and goes, "Your dad killed my dad," Carl goes, "Yeah, my dad's killed lots of people. So have I." And that's basically just the end of it. You know, kid stuff. The wolves are most likely scavengers in the comics. The scavengers are the closest I can find in comparison to the wolves, so that's what I'm going to kind of compare and contrast them to. In the show, we see the wolves make it into Alexandria, and most of the stronger people are gone, and then the wolves just wreak havoc. However, in the comics, the scavengers don't make it inside of Alexandria, and Rick, Michonne, and the stronger characters are all still inside Alexandria, not dealing with the herd, so they're there to protect Alexandria and deal with the wolves. The scavengers approach the gate in the comics, threaten Rick, but are ultimately taken care of before they can even breach the gate. They don't get inside Alexandria. Interestingly, in the comics, when they defend against the scavengers and they use their guns, that gunfire is what draws the herd to Alexandria, and then they have to defend Alexandria against the herd. In the show, Rick and the rest were already out dealing with the herd, and then the wolves attacked, and now the herd is being drawn to Alexandria from the semi-horn. So it's a little bit different, but it's also very similar, and I really liked how they did that. I'm going to leave how they deal with the herd in the comics for now, but there are definitely some scenes in the comics that I really hope they draw inspiration from for the herd versus Alexandria. Mercy killings. The Alexandrians in the show don't take mercy killings too well. Honestly, it is the same in the comics. We see Abraham mercy kill an Alexandrian who had been bit on the shoulder, and the rest of the community looks on in shock. The "we don't have time for this shit" statement probably didn't help as well. Also, in the show, we see a man being bit in the shoulder while dealing with the herd, and in the comics, we actually see a man be bit in the shoulder while dealing with the herd. It's kind of different circumstances of how they were bit and exactly what happened afterwards, but it still happened both in the comics and the show. A man dealing with the herd was bit in the shoulder. Spencer is just as much of a coward in the comics as we see in the show. He has his moments of bravery, but when Alexandria is attacked in the comics, he's willing to just leave his people to die. However, unlike the show, he is also willing to leave his parent, the leader of Alexandria, to die as well. In the show, Spencer is also too scared to go into Alexandria and help his community. However, show Spencer does stay outside to protect his parent. Morgan, I talked a lot about Morgan and how Morgan came to be part of the group and get to Alexandria. It's very different in the comics, so if you want to hear about that, you can watch the first episode of Comics vs. Show for this season. But definitely we see in episode 4 the transition from Morgan being crazy to Zen and Jedi, and that doesn't happen in the comics. He actually gets to Alexandria still a little out there, and he progressively gets better and better. There's actually no Eastman in the comics. There's no person that kind of helped Morgan come back. It was just kind of a group effort of him being around people again and then slowly becoming more and more sure of himself and where exactly he's at. However, I did want to point out Comics Morgan does talk to another comic character, Carl, about how he's not a cold-blooded killer and essentially doesn't enjoy killing, which is similar to the little speech he gave Carol in the show saying, hey, you're not a killer, you don't enjoy that. So the speech was a little bit similar, even if it was two different characters. And while Comics Morgan isn't Zen, he does kill. He does feel people need to hold on to caring for each other, just like Show Morgan does. And kind of randomly, I should have added this in with my first Comics vs. Show for the season, but I forgot. Maggie and Glenn. In the comics, Maggie is not as supportive of Glenn going out. We saw in the show that they were talking about which one of them would go, and Maggie, of course, loves Glenn in the show, but she understands that he needs to go and that there's things that need to be done to protect the community and protect each other. In the comics, Maggie is much more resistant to Glenn going out, to the point where Maggie cries in the comics begging Glenn not to go and even asks Rick to make sure he doesn't go out. So Show Maggie is definitely a lot stronger than comic Maggie at this point, even though Maggie does become progressively stronger. So that is Comics vs. Show for Season 6, Episode 2, 3, and 4. If there's enough material for Episode 5, there will be a Comics vs. Show next week. I will let you know with my Walking Dead review that comes out every Monday. Besides that, make sure you come back for Game of Thrones videos, Star Wars videos, and comics.